My message this morning is entitled Immigration, Racism, and Our Response. So sadly, very sadly, the popular meme that's widely shared on social media every Christmas still rings true. Jesus and his family, fleeing for their lives from King Herod, would have been turned away at the U.S. border. Or anymore, maybe they'd be separated and stuck in cages and detention centers, perhaps for years. Even though the United Nations 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees specifically bars countries from punishing people who have arrived directly from a country of persecution. You know, let's not forget that we are all connected. And let's also remember that we are spiritual refugees. Not only is it our spiritual heritage, as we heard last week, but this is the reality of being a progressive and a spiritual in a nation dominated by evangelical Christians. After last week's message about immigration and the way various kinds of cages our government creates in border areas intentionally destroy people's lives, forcing them into inhumane conditions, many of you told me, I'm mad and I don't know what to do about it. Well, it's exactly how I felt when our group from Vote Common Good left El Paso. I'm mad and I don't know what to do about it. Admittedly, I wanted to share that frustration with you. I wanted us to sit with it for a week as we experience the reality of our nation when it comes to humanitarian need and humanitarian care. The reality of turning our backs on the principle of non-discrimination as described in our 14th Amendment. The reality that the spiritual and humanistic understanding that each of us are created equal has become nothing more than a historical antidote for many of our nation's leaders, as well as a good 25% of our fellow citizens. Yes, I am mad. And I'm glad you are too. Here's the thing, though. That last part, and I don't know what to do about it, that's mostly a half-truth that we tell ourselves. And I say that for two reasons. The first is because we do basically know what to do, but we want it to be bigger, grander, to have a more immediate impact than what we basically know to do will. And the second reason is because what we basically know to do, it takes quite a bit of work. Quite a bit of consistency, quite a bit of sacrifice, and it only yields results over time and as a result of masses of people doing the same things. So, let's start with some reminders of why the work matters. This issue, which is not just a matter of immigration, it's primarily an issue of racism. This issue is a matter of life and death. As a matter of fact, you can ask the family of 37-year-old Roberto Rodriguez Espinoza. You see, 9 days after he entered into ICE custody, Roberto died. He died of a subdural hematoma. The one primary way that happens, blunt trauma to the head. And actually, you can't ask his family, because as far as the Mexican authorities can tell, he has no next of kin. The reality is that this year alone, almost 20 people have died in ICE or Border Patrol custody. 20 people. The reality is that after nearly a decade of no deaths of children with Border Patrol custody, 7 have died in the past year and a half. And when it comes to who's in custody, well, let me put it this way. there's over 550,000 undocumented immigrants in the U.S. who are white. Care to guess how many of them have been taken into custody by ICE or Border Patrol? None. This is not primarily an issue of immigration. It is primarily an issue of race. While we were in El Paso, we attended a congressional hearing, which, as some of you might be wondering, was kind of a rare occurrence. Typically, they're always held on Capitol Hill. But we're not living in typical times, and there's nothing typical about how our government is approaching the moral and spiritual call to care for the sojourner. The hearing was held by the Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship, which is part of the Judicial Committee. The subcommittee is led by Representative Veronica Escobar, an El Paso native, and as far as I'm concerned, she may be our very first Latina president. As she said in her opening remarks, words have consequences. And then she later added, policies have consequences. It should be no surprise that a president who calls immigrants animals can justify treating them as such. Judicial Committee Chair Representative Gerald Nadler from New York later added to that statement, saying, instead of addressing the root cause of migration and competently managing the challenges at the border, this administration has chosen to dehumanize immigrants and to exploit this crisis for political gain. Of course, the primary reason they were meeting in El Paso was because of the racially motivated mass shooting that happened at the local Walmart. As the El Paso Times noted, both Escobar and Nadler emphasized that the racist manifesto investigators believe gunman Patrick Cruces posted online minutes before opening fire in the Walmart mirrors language Trump has used to describe immigrants and Mexicans. The manifesto practically quoted Trump's language, Nadler said. Cruces admitted freely that he drove over 600 miles from his home in Allen, Texas to El Paso for the sole purpose of killing Mexicans. From what I heard on our trip to El Paso, witnesses say that he was literally allowing people who looked white to leave so that he could get a better shot at people of brown skin color. It's something that scholars have actually labeled the Trump effect. Essentially, it's the perceived license for aggression against people of color, in particular, people of color from other nations. We are becoming a nation where increasingly the first approach to people who are different from us is cruelty. We aren't exactly the humanitarian bastion to the world we once strove to be. Representative Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas, who is a firecracker of a person, had this to say about the national tragedy. Racism, white supremacy, and white nationalism is a national security threat.
Yes, it is.
At a press conference that day, Escobar said, "We are going to legislate. We're going to vote on spending bills. We're going to vote on reform bills. We're going to do everything within our power, including educating the American public. But ultimately, it is within the hands of the people to create change, to say this is not acceptable. To say, those of you who have stood silently or who have enabled or who have emboldened this, we are done with you." Ultimately, it's within the hands of the people within the hands of the people to create change, to say, this is not acceptable. When it comes to matters of social justice, there should never be such thing as a silent Christian. For that matter, when it comes to matters of social justice, there should never be such thing as a silent spiritualist or a silent humanist. Bottom line, when it comes to social justice, if you care about anyone other than yourself, if you find value in human life, if your heart has not been hardened to the struggles of others, you should not be silent. Together we must vision a better path. If we recognize our connectedness, if we're truly in touch with our humanity, we are compelled to respond. If we see that, if we can believe that, we should see that in our connectedness, the pain and suffering of one is the pain and suffering of all. But if we work together, we can begin to build places of justice and peace here on earth. So, how do we go about that? Well, as I suggested earlier, for most of us, there is no single grand gesture we can make, that there is no quick fix. This is an issue that can only be fixed by a grassroots movement. There's too much power and too much money to be had to expect our leaders to do it on their own. If you are not a person of color, it starts with listening to folks who have experienced systemic racism and hate. You'll quickly learn that the idea that we live in a post-racial society is imbecilic. Listen, because anti-racism begins with respect. And as you listen, you will probably find that you've got some personal work to do on the issue as well. That's the first step of educating yourself. It's an essential step. Learn the history of racism in the U.S., not just what's taught in school, but the true story of how society and its systems have constantly abused, taken advantage of, marginalized, and devalued people of color. Then help educate others. When you see something, say something. Don't be aggressive, but don't let racial actions or words go unchecked. As Dr. King once said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Also, be intentional about crossing the racial divide that society tries to force on us. Attend every anti-racism rally you can. Put your time and your money into groups who help youth of color. Be a squeaky wheel of justice to your local representatives. On every vote around matters of immigration and race, let them know about your thoughts and encourage them to vote for the common good. And then vote. Vote for candidates who are focused on ending systemic racism. Vote for people of color. As a percentage of the population, people of color are massively underrepresented in our government. And register people to vote. The bottom line is that the larger the poll turnout numbers are, the more likely we are to have candidates who work towards progressive values like humane treatment of immigrants and better laws around racism. And write to your Congress representatives and senators and let them know that it is inexcusable that more hasn't been done to put an end to race-based practices in law enforcement, in the jailing system, in the educational system, as well as in the media. We sometimes say that we don't know what to do about all of this. But I venture to guess that no one was particularly surprised by any of the actions that I just shared with you. The truth is, we basically do know what to do, but it takes quite a bit of work, quite a bit of consistency, quite a bit of sacrifice, and it only yields results over time. But as the Reverend R.H. Edwin Espy, once the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches, said, informed, concerned, and thoughtful citizens can change the world. Not only that, as anthropologist Margaret Mead, who was once the recipient of the Planetary Citizen of the Year Award, said, never doubt that a small group of people, a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.